Recognized.
And I yield to the sponsor of this resolution, Congressman Collins, a U.S. Air Force Reserve chaplain.
Gentleman is recognized for as much time as he wishes to consume.
I thank the Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from South Carolina whose dedication to our men and women in uniform is among no peer in this body, and I thank him for his service and for the fight of his family and others as we come along. I tell you today, I rise, Mr. Speaker, really with a troubled heart, but also with one that is on behalf of the men and women in the Air Force and the Armed Forces and other that are facing something today that they should not have to have faced. There's no doubt our nation is facing many difficulties, and both we across the aisle can understand that, and the majority in this body is standing united to fight for the future of our children and grandchildren. Those are legitimate fights. And I respect my colleague from across the aisle. These are legitimate fights that we are having here. However, today as I stand, I came to this body also looking for practical things and looking for things that amaze me at times, and this is one that does. But as we do and as we fight for others, we must ensure that the basic rights of all are occurring in this body. Military personnel and their families make sacrifices that many of us cannot fathom, and they do so to protect the freedom that we take far too often for granted. Because of their sacrifice, our nation is a beacon of hope to the dark corners of the world where freedom of speech and religion exist only in fairy tales. Yet today, military chaplains who have been contracted to come to bases face a closed door. They cannot go, even if they wanted to volunteer, to practice their faith on these bases during a lapse of appropriations. Across the nation should pause for a moment to consider. Think about what I just said. If a chaplain wants to minister, a contract chaplain wants to minister to a military member stationed abroad who has no access to a church, a mosque, or a synagogue, they would be in violation of the law. I'm a military chaplain, and this breaks my heart. Too often we come to this floor and we talk in abstracts. We talk about concepts, political jargon, arguing about problems that only matter probably within less than 3 miles of this building. But today is different. Today we stand with one resounding voice to tell our service members and the chaplaincy that we will not stand for their First Amendment rights to be violated because the leaders of the other body want to make a point. The laws of this nation require the federal government to ensure military personnel can express their faith or non-faith in all corners of the world. That is why the military chaplaincy exists, and the need for those that when we cannot serve, we contract with others who can provide that basis of their faith. General George Washington issued an order on July 9, 1776, providing through the Continental Congress for a chaplain for each regiment, stating, "The blessing and protection of heaven are at all times necessary, but especially so in times of public distress and danger." The administration is apparently unsatisfied with denying veterans access to memorials, unsatisfied with closing off unmanned scenic overlooks to motorists. Now they must go after, in the words of George Washington, the blessing and protection of heaven for our military families. The body has seen its share of political discord and policy disagreements. The government has experienced numerous lapses in appropriations over the decades, but never before in the history of this nation have the military chaplains and those that they contract with to serve our military personnel been prevented from meeting the religious and spiritual needs of our service members. As a chaplain, I lived and worked alongside men and women in Iraq. Many were religious and many were not. Military chaplains must be allowed, and their contract counterparts must be allowed to provide religious service and ministry regardless of our nation's fiscal state. If the administration wants to play games and score points through unnecessary theatrics, so be it. But I will not stand by and let these games occur at the expense of basic rights of our men and women in uniform. During this lapse in funding, active duty chaplains are permitted to continue serving military personnel. However, there's a chronic shortage of active duty chaplains, particularly for Catholic and Jewish faiths. For example, roughly 25% of the military ascribe to the Catholic faith, but yet Catholic priests make up only 8% of the chaplain corps. That means that approximately 275,000 men and women in uniform and their families are served by only 234 active duty priests, thus the need to have contract chaplains. Due to the shortage of active duty chaplains, it is extremely common for the government to employ chaplains via contract to ensure the spiritual needs of all our military members are met. With the government shutdown, contract members of the chaplain corps on military bases worldwide are not permitted to work, not even permitted to volunteer, even if they're the only chaplain on base. As my friend from South Carolina and others have mentioned, the restrictions on basic freedoms that are being had around here and just within this area, at Langley, at the Navy Yard, at Fort Belvoir, these are all areas in which these have already been cut back, and that is a shame. I'm grateful to my colleagues who joined me this morning and the House leadership for their commitment to ensuring that military chaplains are able to serve the men and women of our armed forces. If this body does not pass this legislation, the ability of military personnel and their family to worship and participate in religious ceremonies will continue to be at great risk. I ask all my colleagues to join me in protecting the First Amendment rights of those who give their lives to protect ours. And before I close, I agree that many times we haven't communicated, and we don't communicate as many would want us to. But I've also heard that timing was a problem here, and that we should have saw this coming. Well, let me just say timing should never be a hindrance to this body protecting the First Amendment rights of any of our citizens, and especially our military personnel. In fact, it should be our highest calling and the thing we run to this floor to discuss. And should we have seen it coming? I tell you, what saddens me is I would have never believed that the administration or anyone else would deem protecting a constitutional right as non-essential. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time.